We are live. All right, come on in, everybody. Welcome back to the Holler. tnholler.com is where you can find us at the TN Holler on Twitter, on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok, YouTube. We don't really mess with Blue Sky anymore, but maybe we will one day. We're trying to be everywhere. We're also hollering all across the state. Thanks to your support. We really do appreciate it. Your small dollar monthly donations are what make this all possible, from Memphis all the way over to the Tri-Cities. And you are the holler, so keep the tips coming and keep telling us what's going on out there. Thank you for your support. Before we get started here, I just want to send a shout out, as always, to a few extra special supporters. Lisa Parker, if you're buying or selling in Middle Tennessee, do it through her. If you need a lawyer, Josh, when you're in Tennessee, Abby Rubenfeld is who you should use. She's fantastic. And if you need any jewelry, AJ Martin, Not Your Grandmother's Jewelry Stores in Nashville. All right. Today we're going to talk about something that we've been talking about quite a bit lately. It's going to be the focus of the session coming up in January. It has been Governor Lee's number one priority since he took office, for reasons we will get into here today. The private school voucher push that currently exists in Memphis and Nashville only because, and Chattanooga now, but only because Republicans across the state didn't want it in their own counties. They only wanted it in Democratic counties and areas. And now these private school vouchers are going to be pushed into every part of the state, all 95 counties, accessible to everybody in Tennessee, not just low-income kids who are in struggling schools. That is the cover story. That is not the reality of what we're about to see. And today we are joined by Josh Cowen, who is a Michigan State professor who studies education policy across the country and has an op-ed today in the Tennessean where he is taking notice because of what's going on here about the vouchers. Josh, how are you today?
Good. How are you doing? Nice to be here.
I am all right. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for paying attention to what's going on in our state. I guess before we get started here, let me just flash real quick your op-ed. This is what you had to say in the Tennessean today. As an education researcher, the data show school vouchers would harm Tennessee students. Now, I know that word is going to scare a lot of people. Data,
yeah,
like, oh my God, it's not just feelings, it's data. So why don't you tell us real quick, what makes you an education policy professor? Like, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So what I do sort of a day job is I try to look at what works, what doesn't work, and when things work and when they don't work for education. Who don't they work for, and who do they work for from a policy perspective? So anything from sort of teacher quality to, in this case, school choice programs. Done a number of different things, but professionally, I kind of grew up actually studying school choice programs, and school voucher programs was part of some of the earliest evaluations at a very young age, actually 20 years ago now. For pilot versions of these types of programs we're talking about today in places like Washington, D.C. Spent a lot of time looking at vouchers and school choice here in Michigan, where I'm based now, but also in Louisiana, New Orleans, where a substantial program exists down there. I started my career actually in public policy, not that far from you guys, or at least closer than we are today, at the University of Kentucky, up there in Lexington. That's where I started my career for the first 5 years. But I've been in Michigan for a while, which is sort of in some sense, one of the origin states for this type of voucher program that we're talking about today. We don't have a voucher program here, but Betsy DeVos and some of the other billionaire backers behind these programs nationally did get their start here. So,
Right, and we should talk about Betsy because she came to Tennessee back in 2019 when Governor Lee first started trying to pass these vouchers and was very clearly involved in the push to expand vouchers to get them into Tennessee.
Yeah.
We show a clip all the time of Betsy DeVos on a Christian radio station talking about how her agenda is to advance God's kingdom
Yeah.
in public education, and the vouchers, I think, are a big part of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the role Betsy DeVos has played in the expansion of vouchers throughout the country?
Well, it's an important quote of hers, and I'm aware of her saying that the vouchers will advance God's kingdom because combining that question with what you just asked about data, there's really no data-driven or research-based case for school vouchers. In fact, quite the opposite. Vouchers have had some of the largest impacts negatively that we've ever seen in education research. I wrote about that for the Tennessean today. Mostly at this point go to children who are already in private school. They act as new bailouts for existing private schools, struggling private schools usually that are barely hanging on financially. And so if you kind of ask yourself, for somebody from my perspective who's sort of saying, well, wait a minute, we have some of the largest negative impacts we've ever seen on any issue in education. Why are these things still persisting? Well, the answer that you have to turn to, and that I've increasingly turned to, is, well, this is an ideological push by folks who have the resources to push it. And it's really not about academic improvement or achievement for children. What it really is about setting up these church schools, bailing them out if they're struggling financially, creating new incentives for churches to create schools, which is an important part of this story too. And generally just sort of, again, creating this ideological push when really it has nothing to do with academic achievement for kids.
I think that's really important for people to hear. And, we've seen examples across the country. In Iowa, they're saying that the tuitions have just gone up.
Yep.
And, that's what's happened, that these schools, mostly not the schools that you would think of. It's more like the smaller and religiously linked schools, that they just raise their tuition to take the money. And it comes from kids who are already going to their school to begin with. In Arizona, we've seen now it's starting to sink their budget as a foreshadowing of what's going to happen here. And, they've also seen that these empowerment scholarships, here they're called freedom scholarships because everything's about freedom in Tennessee, have gone towards all kinds of frivolous things. And then even more importantly, in Arizona, we're now seeing that schools are closing.
Yes.
And at this public comment session for these schools closing, this was recent, this was like last week, they blame vouchers and charter schools for taking funds away from public schools and now causing their schools to close. So is this a fair representation of what's been happening across the country?
Yes. So what's really important to understand here is when vouchers, the technical word we use in the research community is scale up. So when we take them from these smaller versions like you guys have right now in Nashville and Memphis and Chattanooga, and you broaden them out to a statewide basis, that's where you see all this catastrophic set of outcomes, not just for academics, for the children the few children who do transfer from public to private school who aren't already in there, but for state budgets and other outcomes like you're describing. So a couple things to understand here is that when these voucher programs come to town, they fund two different types of schools for the most part. One are financially distressed schools that are barely hanging on in the first place. Most of those are going to be linked to a church in some way, whether they're like a Catholic diocese or sort of a standalone school based in a non-denominational church. So it's expensive to run schools, whether it's public or private. So financially distressed schools that are barely hanging on, that's one type of school that vouchers fund when they scale up. The other type of school is what I referred to a second ago. These are the pop-up schools, the schools that kind of decide to flood the market when there's new tax incentives from the state governments to set them up. And often those are also attached to churches as well. In both cases, though, what you're seeing is kind of, it's not the cream of the crop. So one of the ways that these things get marketed is, well, these are solutions to failing public schools and so on, so-called failing schools. But what's really going on is that you're not talking about these sort of elite college prep academies, things like that. That's what they try to sort of sell this as. What's really going on, again, is These are struggling schools. It's difficult to run a school, often threadbare budgets to begin with, low teacher salaries. And we've seen research evidence actually that when these programs do expand, they become an important part of church budgets. And so private giving to religious organizations and to churches actually goes down. One way to think about this, once vouchers are passed, is actually some sort of mandatory tithing to churches that have decided to set up a school, and that money from the school brings in new dollars to the churches. So it's really, I'm a church going guy, I sing in a choir. This isn't about church or religion, but it is about public policy, and it is about taxpayer dollars. And when we're talking about how these things affect those budgets, that's how they do it.
So we've started to see some pushback, not just from Democrats, but also from Republicans across the state for different reasons. One of the Republican senators in Knoxville took issue with public dollars going to Islamic schools, which obviously is not a great reason to be against this stuff. Another point we've seen coming from Republican circles is that these vouchers would, by constitutional reasons, have to fund undocumented kids if they wanted to go to private school. And I've seen a number of Republicans take issue with that. So what have been the biggest pushbacks you've seen from the Republican side of things, and have any of it worked in pushing these issues back?
Well, I think the unifying thread on that question is most Republican representatives or Democratic representatives who represent rural communities. You just have to look around, if you're listening to me today, how many private schools are in your rural community? Not very many. So when you think about these, and this is why it's important to begin the way we did, when you think about these largely as bailouts for subprime private schools, you look around your community and there aren't very many private schools, subprime or otherwise, to begin with. And that's, I think, the main reason why rural representatives have opposed these things. Certainly, we just, Texas, this is a national push. You guys are just the latest case, unfortunately. But in Texas, it was actually rural Republicans that killed these bills. And this was the main reason. But, I'm not a political strategist, but I do know that you don't tend to serve your constituents very well by voting against what's often the largest employers and the community centers in their districts. It's just not, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's a lot of what's going on there.
Right. We've seen a lot of Republican areas, rural areas, pass resolutions unanimously against this. We've seen school boards stand up against this, partly because, like you said, they're the biggest employer, but also because generally speaking, there is this vilification of public schools in general. But when you drill down into it's your public school, it's your teacher, it's your area, people actually like their public schools.
That's right. And
so,
polling,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and polling data bears that out. So when you ask parents about public schools in general, parents will say they've got some concerns, but then they say, well, how satisfied are you with your public school, with your community? And many of them will say, actually, it's working pretty well for me personally. And that is an important part of the pushback here. One thing I wanted to stress too is that you don't have to be. It's true that you have to be in a school that in a district that has private schools to even have a hope of benefiting from something like this financially, but you don't have to be in a district that has private schools to be harmed by these voucher bills. And the way this works is because the state is starting to spend money on kids whose tuition has been paid by the private sector up until the bill passes. What the state's doing with these bills is it's not for the most part sending new dollars to children to transfer from public to private schools. That's not how public schools get defunded. They get defunded because no state can afford to pay for two sectors of education, a traditional public school and a publicly funded private system of vouchers, which is what is being proposed by Governor Lee and what's been both proposed and passed in other states. States can't afford to do it. So you put that headline up about Arizona. Arizona's budget is broken. And the reason its budget is broken is that right-wing advocacy organizations, that's the one, right-wing advocacy organizations undersold the extent to which these voucher bills pay for kids who are already in private school. They argued this is just a cost transfer, but that's actually not what happens. Only about a quarter of children transfer from public to private schools, about 3/4 of the users of these programs are actually already in private schools. So the state is basically coming in and saying, we're going to put that on our dime now. And in fact, the state can't afford to do that. When that happens, what that means is funding slows down for traditional public schools. State aid goes away. State aid is a very important source of revenue for local districts, especially rural communities. Those dollars start to dry up. You don't have to have an exact cut if you just slow down the funding. That, in the long run, ends up being a cut. In 6 out of the last 7 states to pass voucher programs, those states that have passed the voucher programs have been unable to keep up with public school spending with the states near them that haven't passed the program. So it really makes Tennessee non-competitive from the standpoint of investing in public schools in their communities in the long run.
That's important to hear. And what we're hearing a lot from Governor Lee, Scott Sapicki, people like that are involved in this conversation is, oh, it's just going to be new dollars. These are education freedom scholarships. This is going to be on top of what we're spending. And I think Sapicki in particular maybe has convinced himself of that. But generally speaking, is that what these things are? Do they end up just being more money, or is it taking away from public schools?
In the long run, it takes away. It usually takes about 3 budget cycles for the check to come due on these things. It is true that in the short run, they will find legislative gimmicks like they do for lots of special interest funding to pay for these things out of pocket, and especially when it comes to trying to kind of drag rural legislators over the line. So you do see sometimes in initial legislation, you see these bills written in a way that allows some of the sponsors to claim that this isn't going to defund public schools, and they're relying on overly tedious interpretations of claim. I mean, any employee of any business knows that if you don't get a raise for 3 or 4 or 5 years, at some point that's the same amount as that has the same effect on your budget as a cut if spending is going up in other ways. If your car is more expensive or gas prices are higher or whatever, if you're not getting a raise, that's going to have the same effect as a cut on your family income. And that's basically how these programs begin to defund public schools over the long run. So again, right now, what they're doing is they're saying, well, it's not coming out of public school funding, but down the line, again, it usually takes about 3 years. What happens is these programs do have to cannibalize from public schools because there's only so much of the pie to go around, right? And they're relying on people listening to this, or taxpayers in general, not to pay a lot of attention to what line comes from which part in the state budget.
Also what they're relying on is people having a short memory.
Sure.
I mean, by the time this actually kicks in and starts to hurt these rural schools, Governor Lee's not even going to be there anymore.
Sure.
So he's trying to get something done on behalf of these interests that are going to be paid for decades, and he's going to be gone. He'll have done his part. He'll go try to be, Trump's vice president or whatever. And it's our kids that will suffer.
And that's what happened in Arizona. I mean, there's a Governor Ducey, who rammed this thing through. Despite in 2018, Arizona voters at a statewide ballot initiative rejected a universal voucher program. Then Governor Ducey in Arizona rammed it through legislature, and then he left office. He was term limited, and new Governor Hobbs came in, and now she's got to figure out what to do with this broken budget.
Right. Now it's the Democrats' fault because she's
Sure.
in office, and it's going to look like she's the one hurting public education when it's actually all these policies that were put in place before she got there. And that's what Governor Lee is doing also.
And to be fair, I think some of these legislators who support these things, I do think some of them, and I've met some in other states, again, there's a lot of states doing this right now, really do believe the information that's put in front of them. But what's important to understand is that the information that's being put in front of the legislators in Tennessee, for the most part, are getting that information from Betsy DeVos's organizations, from some Charles Koch organizations, and others that have had a long-standing, decades-long interest in trying to expand these things. And they're just not, frankly, they're not telling the truth. I mean, they're saying, again, in Arizona, they said, look, this is going to be a cost savings. This is going to benefit kids in failing public schools. Well, what actually happened is three-quarters of users, certainly more than half, moved from, didn't move at all, just got their tuition paid for by taxpayers. And that created the budget crisis in Arizona. That number, 3/4, has been true in every state that's passed a voucher program in the last several years. It will be true in Tennessee if that's what happens.
So that's important to hear. We appreciate you sounding the alarm about this. And again, there is a lot of disinformation coming from the exact same people that he's talking about here in Tennessee. AFP, Americans for Prosperity, is leading the push. That's a Koch-backed organization. It has operatives working for them that were the same ones that were here when Speaker Cassada illegally got the vouchers put into Memphis and Nashville. I don't know if you heard about that. I don't have a clip for you, but basically what happened was when this initially got passed, it was a tie vote. And Speaker Cassada held the board open for 45 minutes until they could strong arm Jason Zachary into flipping his vote. And while they did that, there were bribes and threats. And one representative says they offered him a promotion in the National Guard to general. And so there's been all these investigations into it. The Democrats just last week put out a call for the FBI to look into it again. So this has been very shady all along.
Well, I don't know the details in each of these states, but what I do know is that no state anywhere has ever passed vouchers on a direct ballot initiative. So when you put this to actual voters and not through, surveys commissioned by polls commissioned by the DeVos organization or whatever, and when you don't resort to the legislative gimmicks like you're describing, these things fail, and they fail at a 100% rate. They have never actually passed when gone to statewide vote. Whether it's a red state, whether it's a blue state, whether it's a purple state, these things are deeply unpopular. And it's usually not even close. It's usually about 65% of voters reject these things and about 35% accept them. So these are not popular things. And this is why you have to see these kinds of legislative deal making and things like that to get these things through.
Just as a final thing here, if you were giving someone like a quick elevator pitch for why vouchers are bad for Tennessee, what would be the headline things that you would focus on that people can really digest? Like, what are the few bullet points you're like, here's why this is bad for Tennessee kids?
Sure. So first and foremost, these things spend money where they've already been spent by the private sector. So vouchers pay tuition for kids who are already paying tuition. In doing so, they bankrupt state budgets. For the quarter or so, for the 25% or so of children who do transfer from public to private school, we see some of the worst academic outcomes ever seen on any question in the education research community. And the reason for that is that those schools that do get these dollars tend to be subprime providers or financially distressed schools. They're not very good. That's why they're financially distressed, and they need the bailout or they will close. Many actually close already, further hurting children. We haven't talked much about this, but the last piece I would say and I would warn about is that it's very, very important to remember that when it comes to vouchers, it's not school choice at all. It's the school's choice. And what I mean by that is schools still get to pick who they're going to admit. So even if you had a world where theoretically everybody's eligible for a voucher in the universal framework that Governor Lee's proposal makes it, that just means that theoretically you're eligible to get the handout and take the voucher and shop around for a school. But the schools are under no obligation to take you whatsoever. They can turn you away at the door. And we see that that's what happens. They can turn you away because you're not of the same religious value. They can turn you away if you've got, say, an LGBTQ mom or dad or parent. They can turn you away if you're a high schooler who gets pregnant. They can turn you away if you or your student has a special need or a disability the school just doesn't want to serve you for. We've seen this in state after state after state. When it comes to vouchers, it's the school's choice, not school choice. That's really, really important to remember as well.
That is important to remember. And it's also important to remember that they don't get held to the same accountability standards as public schools. So, and Governor Lee was asked about this and he played dumb, but he knows they won't. And so their reason for pushing these vouchers is supposedly because achievement is low, but then you're going to solve that problem by steering kids to places where you don't even measure this stuff. So how does that make any sense?
And where it's been measured, and the reason that I wrote this piece for the Tennessean is that the data haven't really been collected for the Tennessee voucher program as it exists right now. And the reason for that is they know that over the last decade, the track record is dreadful. They see the same results I do. I know many of the same people. We've all known each other for years looking at this stuff. They know that the results are dreadful. And that's why the latest iteration of voucher programs, Tennessee and every other state since about 2019, no accountability provisions whatsoever. If they thought that accountability and transparency and how these kids were doing on outcomes was going to help their cause, they'd be the first to push these through in legislation so they could not only justify what they did in the state that they're pushing it today, but also in future states. But they know that the accountability, the outcomes, when you actually look under the hood and see how these things are doing, they know that it makes these programs look terrible. They know it makes these programs look like a mistake. And that's why they keep these things hidden, the outcomes hidden from taxpayers. They don't want folks to know what's really going on. And that's just the reality. And I will say that it didn't used to be true back when they thought that these things would actually work. It's how we know how dreadful they are. But today it's going to take some type of, well, I don't know. We're not going to know how these new programs are performing, unfortunately.
Well, it sounds like that's the reason. It sounds like that's the reason that Governor Lee and the Republicans in Tennessee are pushing to expand this program before we even have the results of how the pilot program is working, because they're worried about what those results will say. It's not because they're in some sort of rush to help kids. It's because they're in a rush to avoid people understanding what's really going on.
Once you put these things through, it's almost impossible to pull them back. Once these things become law, no state has ever pulled back a voucher law. Illinois has become the first state to slowly phase its tax credit program out, which mathematically is the same thing as a voucher, but it's not a direct appropriation. That's the other reason they're rushing, is that once this information, the other states in Arizona, in Iowa, in Arkansas, next door to you guys, once the results from those programs start to trickle in, it's going to be more and more and more difficult to ram these things through legislatures, whether Republican or Democrat at all. And so that's the other rush, is to get this thing through and then, hope that no matter what happens, it's on the next governor or the next legislature to pay the bills and to answer for the program's results.
Josh, thanks for talking to us. Thanks for the op-ed that you wrote. Again, this is the op-ed that Josh has in the Tennessean today. Keep an eye on us. Come back and talk to us more later, and we appreciate your time.
Sure. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Josh. So that is Josh Cowen. He is a Michigan State education policy professor who wrote an op-ed in the Tennessean today using actual data, which I know a lot of people don't love, to show that vouchers harm Tennessee students and that we should take the warnings from broken budgets in other states, academic failures, that the damage is being done. As Senator Heidi Campbell wrote today, it's really tragic. Tennessee has elected people willing to sell our kids' futures for their own personal gain. And that's the message today. It's talk to your reps, talk to your senators, talk to Governor Lee, reach out to them, let them know you know what's going on here. Tell them not to sell our kids out to the special interests that filled the room at Governor Lee's announcement not long ago. I was there. It was very clear that there were a lot of people in that room that were really just looking to fill their pockets and push this ideological program. And then I just want to end by showing this clip of families in Arizona as their schools are on the verge of closing, they think, because of this school choice / privatization agenda.
As a parent, it's devastating. It's heartbreaking.
Sarah Huddleston says that's how she felt reading an email from her 2 kids' principal at Desert Springs Prep, saying the school was one of 4 the Paradise Valley Unified School District is considering closing.
There was tears. My 7-year-old was simply said, why would they close our school? We have the best school.
Teachers like Nicole Berg wondering the same. She watched her 4 kids attend Desert Springs before changing careers to teach.
We really try to set ourselves as like a specialty school, and the news was very devastating to our community.
The district says this is due to declining enrollment. The other 3 schools being considered for closure, Hidden Hills and Sunset Canyon Elementary Schools and Vista Verde Middle School. This plan would also mean boundary changes for more than 10 other schools.
I come here tonight to beg you to vote no on this plan of closing our beloved school.
Staff and parents from those 4 schools showing up to the district's meeting Thursday. Teachers emotional, some even bringing letters from their students.
You can blame the vouchers and the charter schools along with the slashes to education funding.
You could blame vouchers and charter schools along with the cuts to education funding. Does that sound familiar, Tennessee? Does that sound familiar? So when they say that, people saying these vouchers are an attack on public schools from Governor Lee and his privatization friends, that is not hyperbole. It's what's happening. in the states that have passed that stuff. And so the time to protect public schools is right now. This will be the fight this session. It is not a foregone conclusion. I don't say that lightly. I've heard rumors that Republicans are not necessarily sure that they want to get on board for this. So the time to reach out to your legislators and let them know that you see through Governor Lee's private school voucher scam is right now. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.